Picture a library. What do you see? Long rows of books, pools of lamplight, and above everything else, silence. That particular quality of quiet that feels almost sacred, like a church or a museum, a place where noise feels like a violation.
And if you've ever accidentally spoken at normal volume in a library and felt 20 pairs of eyes turn toward you, you know the feeling. That immediate flush of embarrassment, the sense that you have broken something important.
But here's the question nobody asks. Why? Why are libraries silent? Who decided that? Was it always this way? And is there something deeper going on? Something about power and knowledge and who gets to decide the rules of a space?
Because libraries haven't always been quiet. For most of human history, they were anything but. And the shift to silence, when it happened, why it happened, and who enforced it, turns out to be a surprisingly revealing story about how societies think about knowledge.
Let's go back to the beginning, the first libraries.
The oldest library we know of with any certainty is the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, in what is now northern Iraq, built by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BC. It contained tens of thousands of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform text, and we know quite a lot about how it was used, because many of the tablets survive.
And those tablets were not read silently. Reading in the ancient world was almost always done aloud. The idea of reading silently, of processing text entirely internally without moving your lips or making any sound, was genuinely unusual, almost unknown.
There's a famous passage in St. Augustine's Confessions, written around 400 AD, where he describes watching his teacher, Ambrose of Milan, read. And Augustine is struck, genuinely surprised, by the fact that Ambrose reads without making any sound. He describes it as remarkable, something worth noting.
Which tells you everything about what normal reading looked like. If silent reading was remarkable enough for Augustine to write about it in the 4th century AD, more than 1,000 years after the Library of Ashurbanipal, then the default mode of reading for most of human history was audible.
People read aloud to themselves. Scholars in ancient libraries would have been murmuring, muttering, sometimes speaking at full volume. The Great Library of Alexandria, the most famous library of the ancient world, founded in the 3rd century BC, would have been a place of considerable noise. Multiple scholars reading simultaneously, discussing texts, debating interpretations.
The medieval monastery libraries of Europe were similarly active, in a different way. Monks were required to read out loud as part of their devotional practice. Reading scripture was a form of prayer, and prayer was spoken. Silence in a monastic library wasn't the rule. It was, if anything, suspicious. A monk sitting silently with a book might be daydreaming rather than reading.
There were some monastic traditions, the Cistercians, the Trappists, that enforced general rules of silence throughout the monastery. But even there, the silence was about discipline and devotion, not about protecting other readers from noise. It was spiritual, not practical.
So when did the shift happen? When did libraries become the hushed, reverent spaces we know today?
The answer is relatively recently, and it's connected to a specific set of social and technological changes that came together in the 18th and 19th centuries.
The first factor is the spread of literacy. Before the printing press, before Gutenberg's movable type in the 1440s, books were rare, expensive, handmade objects. Literacy was largely confined to clergy, scholars, and the wealthy. Libraries were small, specialist places.
The printing press changed everything. Books became cheaper and more numerous. Literacy spread, slowly at first, then accelerating through the 17th and 18th centuries. And as literacy spread, the nature of reading changed. Silent reading became the norm rather than the exception, because you could now read to yourself without needing someone to help you decode the text.
And as silent reading became normal, audible reading became disruptive. If you're trying to read silently, someone murmuring next to you is an interruption in a way it wouldn't have been when everyone was making noise anyway.
The second factor is the emergence of the public library as a civic institution. Before the 19th century, most libraries were private, owned by institutions, universities, wealthy individuals, or the church. Access was restricted and controlled.
The public library movement, which gathered momentum in Britain and America in the mid-19th century, was built on a genuinely radical idea that ordinary working people deserved access to books and knowledge, that literacy and self-improvement were democratic rights, not privileges.
Britain's Public Libraries Act was passed in 1850. It allowed local councils to establish free public libraries funded by taxation. The first rate-supported public library in Britain opened in Manchester in 1852. Within decades, public libraries had spread across the country.
And these new public libraries needed rules. They were serving a broader, more mixed population than private scholarly libraries. The people running them, often deeply earnest Victorian reformers who genuinely believed in the improving power of knowledge, wanted to create an environment conducive to serious study.
Silence became one of the defining rules of the Victorian Public Library, and the reasoning was partly practical — noise disturbs concentration — but also partly social. The library was supposed to be a space of self-improvement, a space where the working classes could better themselves.
And self-improvement in the Victorian imagination looked a certain way. It looked like quiet, like discipline, like the kind of studious, focused behavior associated with the educated middle and upper classes. The library was not just providing books, it was modeling a particular kind of respectable behavior.
There's something slightly uncomfortable about that when you examine it. The silence of the Victorian library wasn't just about acoustics, it was also about class, about teaching working-class visitors to behave in ways that middle-class reformers considered appropriate.
The library as a civilizing institution, which is a phrase that was actually used at the time approvingly by the people building them. They genuinely believed they were doing something beneficial, but embedded in that belief was an assumption about whose behavior needed civilizing.
And the physical design of libraries reinforced the rules. High ceilings that amplified sound, open floor plans where every noise carried, the librarian's desk positioned to oversee the entire space. Architecture designed to make noise feel transgressive, to make you feel watched and self-conscious the moment you raised your voice.
The librarian as enforcer is itself a Victorian invention. The stern, shushing librarian, the figure that has become a cliché, emerged from this period. Not because librarians were naturally severe people, but because the rules of the institution made them responsible for maintaining the silence that the ideology of the library demanded.
There's a wonderful irony here. Libraries were built to give people access to ideas, to open minds, to facilitate the free exchange of knowledge, and yet they enforced silence, one of the most effective ways of preventing the actual exchange of ideas, which requires conversation.
Ancient scholars debated in libraries. Medieval monks discussed texts. Renaissance humanists argued over manuscripts. And then the Victorian Public Library said, "Quiet, please."
It's worth noting that not all library traditions went this way. In Jewish scholarly tradition, the house of study, the Beit Midrash, has always been a place of noise. Pairs of scholars studying together, arguing over texts, reading aloud to each other. The noise is the point. It signals active engagement with the material.
The Talmud, the central text of Rabbinic Judaism, is itself structured as a record of arguments and debates. It doesn't resolve into a single authoritative answer. It preserves the disagreements, the back and forth, the noise of centuries of scholars talking to each other. The idea that study should be silent and solitary is completely foreign to this tradition.
Similarly, in many East Asian scholarly traditions, recitation, reading aloud, memorizing by speaking, has been central to the educational process. The Confucian tradition placed enormous value on oral transmission of knowledge. Silence was not a virtue in the study room.
So the silent library is not a universal human instinct. It's a specific Western and specifically Victorian cultural choice, one that has spread so thoroughly and been in place for so long that it now feels natural, inevitable, almost biological.
But it isn't. It's a rule that was invented, for specific reasons, by specific people, at a specific moment in history.
Now, there's a counterpoint to all of this, and it's worth making. Silence in libraries does serve a real function, not just an ideological one. Cognitive science is fairly clear that noise impairs concentration for complex reading and thinking tasks.
Irrelevant speech, other people talking, even at low volume, is particularly disruptive. Unlike music or background noise, which some people can tune out, the brain has difficulty ignoring speech because it's always trying to parse language. Even if you don't consciously register what someone nearby is saying, part of your cognitive processing is engaged with it.
So silence in a reading room isn't just Victorian class anxiety, it's also genuinely useful. The Victorians may have arrived at the right answer for partly the wrong reasons.
The modern library has started to complicate the silence rule in interesting ways. Many public libraries now have designated quiet zones and designated social zones, spaces where conversation is encouraged, where children can be noisy, where community events happen. The idea that the entire building must be silent has relaxed considerably.
Some libraries have coffee shops, maker spaces, recording studios, performance areas. The Library of Birmingham, opened in 2013 and one of the largest public libraries in Europe, has a rooftop terrace, a Shakespeare memorial room, and a regular program of public events. It is emphatically not a silent building.
Which is arguably a return to something older than the Victorian model. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a repository of books. It was a center of active intellectual life, connected to a museum and a dining hall where scholars lived and debated. It was loud, social, argumentative.
The ideal library might be both things: silent enough for deep concentration, lively enough for genuine exchange. The challenge is designing a space and a culture that holds both.
And perhaps being slightly less mortified the next time you accidentally speak at normal volume and everyone looks at you. You're not violating some ancient law of nature. You're just bumping up against a Victorian social convention that's had 150 years to embed itself into the walls.
Which, when you think about it, is exactly the kind of thing we're here to unpick.
It really is.
Thank you for listening to the Why Behind Everything. If you've been enjoying these episodes, please subscribe on YouTube. It takes 2 seconds and it helps enormously.
Next time we're asking, why is Friday the 13th considered unlucky? The number 13 and Friday as an unlucky day started as two completely separate superstitions, centuries apart, different cultures, different reasons. The story of how they merged into one of the most widespread fears in the modern world is stranger than you'd expect.
See you then.